All right, let's open a map, but not the one your history teacher rushed past. This is the map history books skip, the one where the ocean itself is doing the heavy lifting. See, everyone talks about ships, big ships, fancy ships. Could ancient people build ships strong enough? But here's the plot twist. What if ships weren't the main characters at all? What if the Atlantic Ocean was the Uber driver? Ancient ocean currents, especially the Atlantic conveyor belt, move in predictable loops. Warm currents flow from Africa toward the Americas, while return currents head back the other way. These aren't random splashes. They're powerful, steady, and ancient. Long before GPS engines or even sails as we know them, the ocean already had a route planned. Now pause for a second. If fishermen, traders, or explorers drifted into these currents, intentionally or accidentally, the ocean wouldn't ask questions. It would just carry them. No passport, no visa, just vibes. That's why ancient navigation wasn't always about steering. It was about understanding when to let go. Read the stars, watch the birds, feel the wind, and let the water finish the job. Suddenly, pre-Columbian travel doesn't sound so impossible, does it? So when history says there was no contact, you have to ask, did they study the ocean or just the ships? Because once you realize the Atlantic wasn't a barrier but a moving highway, a lot of impossible stories start sounding inconveniently possible. Now, quick question for you. If the ocean itself was navigating, who really discovered who? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading them like ancient scrolls. And hey, don't just float away like a driftwood log. Like this video if your mind just sailed somewhere new. Subscribe before the algorithm throws you overboard. Share this with that friend who thinks history is settled. Because sometimes the truth travels by current. Let's talk about the ocean's cheat code. No compass required. Because long before Google Maps said, turn left, the Atlantic Ocean already had directions built in. Meet the Canary Current. Think of it as Africa's west coast, giving the ocean a gentle but very confident shove. This current flows southward along northwest Africa, then curves west, straight toward the Americas. No engine, no rowing, just physics doing its thing. Now add the north and south equatorial currents to the story. These currents move steadily east to west, right across the Atlantic. Translation: if you float, the ocean votes for America. They're wide, strong, and consistent, basically the Atlantic saying, relax, I got this. Here's the fun part. This isn't ancient theory. It's still happening today. Scientists have tracked floating objects, seeds, boats, and even debris drifting from Africa and landing in the Caribbean and South America. Some without motors, some without sails, some without a clue. The ocean doesn't care about your plans. It follows its own. So imagine ancient fishermen, traders, or explorers getting caught in these currents. Not racing, not conquering, just drifting with purpose. Sometimes the smartest move isn't paddling harder. It's knowing when to stop fighting the water. And this is where history gets awkward. If the Atlantic had natural highways, then crossing it wasn't a miracle. It was a matter of timing. Suddenly, impossible starts sounding like we didn't check the currents. Now your turn. If you could cross the Atlantic without rowing, would you call that luck or knowledge? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm scrolling like an ancient navigator, and don't drift past this moment. Like if the ocean just humbled technology. Subscribe before the algorithm pushes you offshore. Share this with someone who thinks history never floats, because sometimes the sea does the steering. Let's clear something up. Ancient African seafaring was not primitive. That idea, a modern myth dressed up as history. Because when people say they didn't have the technology, what they really mean is, we didn't look. Start with ancient Egypt. These weren't people paddling around hoping for the best. Egyptians built large wooden ships, stitched plank vessels, and sea-going boats strong enough to travel the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. They imported cedar from Lebanon, mapped river routes, and timed voyages with winds and currents. Primitive. Please. That's logistics. Now slide west. In West Africa, long before Europeans showed up with notebooks, communities along the Niger River and Atlantic coast mastered river-sea travel. Their boats weren't just for fishing. They were built for trade, migration, and distance. Wide hulls for stability, shallow drafts for rivers, designs that handled waves without panic. That's engineering, without PowerPoint. And here's the part that really messes with the no technology argument. Technology doesn't always look like metal and machines. Sometimes it looks like knowledge of tides, winds, stars, seasons, and wood behavior. Ancient African seafarers didn't fight nature. They partnered with it. The ocean was the engine, timing was the fuel. So when modern voices say they couldn't cross long distances, ask them this. If you can navigate thousands of kilometers of rivers, coasts, and seas, why would the ocean suddenly scare you? Let's be honest. The myth of primitive Africa survives because it's convenient. But once you zoom out, the evidence floats right to the surface. Quick question for you. What counts as technology, machines, or mastery? Drop your answer in the comments before history tries to sail away again. All right, buckle up, because we're about to talk about engines that don't make noise. Welcome to the era before engines, when the wind did the work and nobody complained about fuel prices. This is the story of trade winds, not the buy one, get one free kind. These are steady, seasonal winds that blow east to west across the Atlantic like clockwork. Ancient sailors didn't fight them. They waited for them, because timing wasn't luck, it was knowledge. There were sailing windows, moments in the year when the wind basically said, "All right, now you can go." Miss it, and you stayed home. Catch it, and the ocean opened like a door. And how did ancient travelers navigate without Google Maps? Easy. Stars, winds, and birds. Stars gave direction. Winds gave speed. Birds gave land clues. If birds flew out in the morning and came back at night, congrats. Land was close. If they didn't come back, well, keep sailing. These travelers weren't guessing. They were reading nature. The sky was the dashboard. The ocean was the road. The wind, the engine. Now here's where history gets spicy. That same wind system, the trade winds, is exactly what Christopher Columbus used in 1492. He didn't invent the route. He followed it. And guess where that wind path starts? Yep, along the African coast. So when someone says, Columbus discovered the route, you can politely respond, he followed an African route with better marketing. Quick question for you. If ancient people mastered winds, stars, and seasons, do we really get to call them primitive? Drop your answer in the comments. I promise I'm not sailing past it. And don't drift off just yet. Like if wind just replaced engines in your mind. Subscribe before the algorithm changes direction. Share this with someone who thinks history runs on fuel. Because sometimes the strongest engine is invisible. Let's talk about the kind of trips nobody plans, but history never forgets. Welcome to Accidental Voyages. When the ocean cancels your return ticket and upgrades you to legend. Because here's the thing. Not every journey starts with a plan. Sometimes it starts with a storm. 1 minute you're a fisherman checking nets. Next minute, boom. Wind shifts, waves rise, and the ocean says, "Surprise, we're going on a longer trip." Storm-driven drift voyages are real. Not myths, not movies, just physics plus bad weather. Strong winds and powerful currents can carry boats far beyond their intentions. No steering meeting, no consent form, just motion. Now imagine ancient fishermen, coastal traders, or explorers caught in that situation. These weren't people who panicked at water. They lived on it. They knew how to survive, ration, repair, and wait. So instead of sinking, many drifted, sometimes for weeks, carried by currents that didn't care about borders. And here's where history gets uncomfortable. You don't need thousands of successful crossings to change the world. You only need one boat that survives. One crew that lands, one story that gets told, one exchange of people, ideas, or genes. That's it. History doesn't require repetition. It requires proof of possibility. So when people say it couldn't have happened because it wasn't planned, remind them. Most of the history wasn't planned. Empires fell by accident. Continents were stumbled upon. Even your favorite mistakes taught you something. Quick question for you. If a single storm can rewrite a map, how confident are we in the old ones? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I promise I won't drift past them. And before you sail off accidentally, like if storms deserve more credit, subscribe before the algorithm blows the wrong way. Share this with someone who thinks history only happens on purpose, because sometimes history changes by mistake. All right, now let's talk about the clues that didn't get lost at sea, because sometimes history doesn't scream, it whispers. And archaeology? It's basically that quiet friend who says, "I told you so," years later. Let's start with the Olmec heads. These massive stone sculptures in ancient Mesoamerica are impossible to ignore, unless you're actively trying to. Broad noses, full lips, distinct facial features. For decades, people have stared at them and said, "Wow, interesting," and then immediately changed the subject. Is this proof of African contact? Archaeologists argue, scholars debate, comment sections explode. But the real question isn't, are they African? It's why the conversation makes people uncomfortable. Now zoom out. Beyond faces, there are shared crops, symbols, and cultural parallels that raise eyebrows. Plants appear where they shouldn't. Similar artistic motifs, overlapping spiritual symbols. None of these shout, "Case closed!" But together, they quietly tap the table like, "So, explain to us." Here's the thing about archaeology. It's slow, painfully slow, one artifact at a time. No drumroll, no fireworks. Textbooks, on the other hand, love certainty. Big dates, clean timelines, bold statements, even when the evidence is still whispering. That's why new discoveries often get footnotes instead of headlines. Because whispers are inconvenient when you've already printed the book. So when someone says, "There's no evidence," what they often mean is, there's no evidence that fits neatly. Quick question for you. If multiple small clues point in the same direction, at what point do we stop calling it a coincidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm listening like an archaeologist with a brush. And before the whispers fade, like if history deserves better listening, subscribe before the algorithm buries this under sand. Share this with someone who thinks textbooks are always loud and right. Because sometimes the past speaks softly but clearly. All right, now we're stepping into the room where science suddenly lowers its voice. Welcome to DNA, the evidence that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, and definitely doesn't care about feelings. Because here's the thing, DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't have opinions. It doesn't read textbooks. It doesn't know which story is acceptable. It just sits there like, "Hey, this is what I found." Over the years, genetic markers and blood type patterns have raised some very uncomfortable questions. Not headlines, not parades, just quiet moments where scientists pause, reread the data and go, "Nah." Markers that don't fit cleanly into the popular timeline. Patterns that suggest contact, mixing, or movement that history didn't schedule. Now doom, before anyone panics. No, DNA doesn't announce. Breaking news. Everything is wrong, it whispers. It suggests. It nudges. And sometimes it gets ignored. Why? Because data is easy. Rewriting stories, not so much. DNA might say, "These people met." But institutions here. We need new textbooks. And here's the awkward truth. Science often admits things quietly before it admits them publicly. Papers get cautious language. Words like possible, suggestive, requires further study. Translation? This is interesting. But let's not fight the system today. So when someone says, "There's no genetic evidence," what they often mean is, there's no genetic evidence we're comfortable talking about loudly. Quick question for you. If the evidence survives in our blood, but the story doesn't, which one do you trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading them like a genetic code. And before this data gets quietly filed away, like if science should speak up, subscribe before the algorithm mutates. Share this with someone who thinks truth is always announced with a megaphone, because sometimes the loudest evidence is silent. All right, now we're at the part where history starts shifting in its seat. Because this isn't just about boats, winds, or DNA anymore. It's about why certain stories make people uncomfortable. Let's ask the quiet question out loud. Who benefits from a closed ancient world? A world where continents stayed politely in their lanes, nobody visited anybody early, and progress followed a neat, one-way timeline. Clean, simple, very convenient. A closed world makes history easy to manage. It decides who gets credit, who gets footnotes, and who gets introduced late to the story like, oh yeah, they showed up too. Narratives aren't just stories. They're power tools. They shape their identity. They decide who looks innovative, who looks passive, and who looks behind. Now here's the uncomfortable part. When evidence suggests contact, movement, or shared knowledge, it doesn't just update a timeline, it reshuffles identity. And identity is emotional. People protect it like family recipes. That's why some questions get labeled controversial instead of interesting. It's safer to say there's no evidence than to say, we didn't pay attention. And yes, there's a huge difference between lack of evidence and lack of attention. One means nothing exists. The other means nobody bothered to look closely or listen carefully. Archaeology whispers, DNA nudges, currents hint. But textbooks prefer certainty because uncertainty invites conversation, and conversation invites change. So when this history makes people uncomfortable, it's not because it's weak. It's because it's disruptive. Quick question for you. If a story feels uncomfortable, does that mean it's wrong or just unfinished? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading them like a timeline with erasures. And before comfort wins again, like if curiosity matters, subscribe before the algorithm settles the story too early. Share this with someone who thinks history never needs revising, because sometimes discomfort is just truth stretching its legs. All right, let's flip the map upside down for a second. Because what if the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a wall, but a bridge? We've been taught to see the Atlantic like a giant "do not cross" sign. Endless water, certain doom, game over. But ancient humans looked at it differently. To them, the ocean wasn't an obstacle, it was a highway with mood swings. Think about it. Rivers connect villages, seas connect regions, oceans connect civilizations, if you know how to read them. Currents, winds, stars, seasons. Ancient people didn't stare at the water and say, impossible. They said, not today. Maybe next month. The real mistake we make is assuming ancient humans were fragile, clueless, and permanently confused. These were people who built pyramids without cranes, mapped stars without telescopes, and crossed deserts without GPS. But we draw the line at boats? Really? If humans can walk into deserts, climb mountains, and settle frozen tundras, why does water suddenly become the one thing they never figured out? Especially when fish, trade, curiosity, and accidents all lived near the coast. The Atlantic didn't separate people, it filtered them. Only those with skill, patience, and timing made the crossing. And history doesn't need millions of crossings. It needs moments. One successful journey can connect cultures for generations. So maybe the Atlantic wasn't a boundary at all. Maybe it was a slow-moving meeting place. A place where ideas, people, and stories drifted, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by surprise. Final question for you. If the ocean connected us once, who decided it couldn't? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm crossing back to read them. Like if maps deserve a second look. Subscribe before the algorithm redraws the world. Share this with someone who thinks water only divides. Because maybe, just maybe, the Atlantic never separated us. All right, before you scroll like nothing just happened, let's pause the ship right here, because this part needs you. If oceans connect continents, what else connects our past? Seriously, think about it. Currents move water, winds move ships, stories move people. So why do we act like history only moves in straight lines written in bold font? This series wasn't made to hand you a neat little answer with a bow on it. It was made to poke the timeline with a stick and say, hey, are you sure about this part? And history doesn't update itself in silence. It updates when people talk, argue, question, compare notes. So don't just watch this like it's background noise while you're scrolling. Jump into the comments like it's a late-night debate with receipts. Drop your thoughts. Do oceans divide humanity? Or did they connect us way earlier than we were told? Do these ideas feel uncomfortable? Or do they finally make sense? There are no wrong comments here, only curious ones. Okay, except first. We're past that stage. Now quick favor before you drift away like a forgotten artifact. Like this video if it made you rethink even one assumption. Share it with that friend who says, history is settled. Subscribe, because next episode we're opening the folder labeled, The Evidence Textbooks Won't Footnote. The stuff that lives in margins, whispers in data, and makes historians clear their throats. History isn't finished talking. The real question is, are we ready to listen?